Moroni Flake. I'm the CEO of Homebase. I've been working
Yeah.
international since 2015, and our focus with Homebase is really
Okay.
two areas: reducing the workload for
Yeah.
international
I'm hoping to work.
international offices, DSOs and AROs, and then improving the experience for students and scholars. And so these webinars are kind of a part of those efforts. So how do we essentially evolve the processes, kind of create a community of universities working toward best practice together, and then support that through technology. And and so I'll send out a little some additional information about that in some follow-up emails. We'll also send the slides out as well, and and we'll go from there. And then I'll turn it over to Mandy.
Thank you so much, Moroni, for having me. And it's incredible to see so many universities and institutions represented. As you mentioned, my name is Mandy Feuerbacher. I am a former U.S. consular officer and also a licensed immigration attorney. And just a little bit about my background, I spent about 7 years as a consular officer with the State Department. And during that time, I interviewed over 100,000 visa applicants. I'm also a regular speaker at NAFSA and American Immigration Lawyers Association conferences. And sometimes I also write for publications on hot button visa and immigration topics. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. I work with a number of universities, and I know that it's a really stressful time for all of you right now. There are a lot of changes happening at lightning speed, and I just want you to know that, you're not in this alone. And I love this community that Homebase has built, and we're all here to support each other, to help your students, and hopefully to give international students the best possible education they can have, which I still believe is in the United States, and to make everybody feel welcome, which is not necessarily easy to do right now. Um, so, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to quickly go through a recap of President Trump's first term. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what the visa refusal rate looks like in 2024 versus 2023, some anticipated changes and updates to F1 visas, visa interview myths and realities, and then leave some time for Q&A. And before we start, I just want to mention that this is obviously for general informational purposes only. It's not legal advice or guidance. And so if your students ever have any complicated visa issues, it's always important that they reach out to an experienced immigration attorney. Visa situations can be so nuanced and so case dependent, fact specific. So it's always a good idea to have your students work with professionals, especially when in this industry and around the world, there's a lot of false information flying around via agents, via, the internet. And so it's important that we give accurate advice and information to students. Okay, so if we look back to President Trump's first term, what we saw was, there were obviously more administrative processing delays. We saw longer wait times. That was when they started with the DS 5535 extreme vetting process, which some of your students or scholars may go through. And we also saw the introduction of Presidential Proclamation 10043, which limited students and researchers from China if the US government was concerned that, they were doing particularly sensitive research and they've worked for universities that, may have been involved in civil military fusion strategy. So this is kind of what we saw in the first term. Now, if we take a look at what the visa denial numbers look like most recently, these numbers were released by the State Department earlier this year. We saw a big jump in visa denial numbers for F1 visas. So in fiscal year 2023, what we saw was 34% of student visa applicants had problems at their visa interview, whether it was cases that were delayed in administrative processing or just straight out visa denials by the visa officers. That was already a lot. That meant over 1 in 3 students were having issues. Now we saw a big jump in 2024. Okay, so now all of a sudden we've gone up to 41%. And this is concerning. And I think that has been the trend in recent years that visa officers have been getting a little bit tougher at interviews. And I don't want to make any speculations about 2025, but my sense is that it probably will go up given the rhetoric from the White House and sort of this anti, immigration stance that's coming out. How that usually plays out at US embassies and consulates around the world is that visa officers already have a lot of discretion over individual visa applications. Now they will probably feel a little bit more empowered to take a hardline approach, a hardline stance towards issuing visas, which means that your students have to be even more prepared than they have been in the past. They have to be ready at their visa interview. They have to know what to say to the visa officer. They have to know how to start that interview, how to answer the first question. We're going to go into that a little bit later. But the process is just becoming tougher for students. And I think, as institutions and universities still wanting to welcome international students, we need to give them the tools and the resources that are available to help them succeed so they can actually end up showing up on campus and studying. Now, J1 visas for visiting scholars, this is good news. There hasn't been a whole lot of change, and the denial and complication numbers are actually quite low. So 11% of visiting scholars had problems or got stuck in administrative processing. And M1 visas, which I've seen mostly for aviation, flight schools, again, not too much change, went from 25 to 26%. So now, as we are in President Trump's second term, here are some expected changes and updates based on what we've seen. We have new Trump administration policies that will lead to additional delays. Okay, we've already seen that happen. And what we're looking at are federal hiring freezes and reductions in force across the board. So President Trump's administration has worked very hard on cutting down on the federal government workforce from, closing down USAID to, basically asking federal agencies, tell us which personnel you think are absolutely necessary. In my circles at the State Department, a lot of, senior foreign service officers, the people who are consular officers who work in the consular sections are considering retiring early because they're given certain incentives to do so. And so when you have both of these things happening, you're seeing fewer visa officers who are able to make decisions on the visa applications of your students and visiting scholars. And so you have to be prepared that there's going to be more delays. Trump's administration is also in the middle of closing several small consulates. This is mostly in Europe, so hopefully won't impact, visa processing for your students too much unless you get a lot of European students. Delays in OPT authorizations. We will be seeing additional screening of visa applicants, whether that's an increase of the number of students that are being vetted or perhaps the introduction of additional processes that might slow down the process for students. There's been a recent change to the Dropbox policy. And so if your students are coming to you and have questions about whether or not they qualify for Dropbox, Dropbox, by the way, is the process of getting a new student a new visa without having to go through the visa interview process again. Post-COVID, that process was greatly expanded with people being able to renew their visas as long as they've had a US visa within the last 48 months. It's been changed recently, and the restrictions are tighter now. You had to have had a visa within the last 12 months. You have to be applying in your home country. There's been updates, and so definitely review the changes to the Dropbox policy if this is something that your students encounter a lot or have questions about. Also, there used to be a global wait times page that the State Department would share that was always very helpful for foreign nationals who are trying to decide, okay, should I apply in my home country? What does the wait time look like there? What does the wait time look like, at a neighboring country? Unfortunately, as of January 7th, the numbers stopped being updated, and shortly thereafter, they've actually completely deactivated this page, which is concerning because this was a great tool for students to determine, where they should go in for their student interviews. Is there a place that's faster? And right now, what you have to do basically is you have to go through the normal process of paying for a visa interview appointment, starting your DS 160 process, and then that allows you to open up the calendar to figure out whether or not, when you can get a visa appointment. Basically, what students have to do now is just go through the process before they can see what's available. However, students may be able to qualify for expedited visa appointments if they have a program start date that is happening soon. And so I think that the messaging that we should be giving to students is definitely to plan early, plan in advance. A couple of years ago, the State Department permitted students to start getting their visa appointments and visa processing done within 365 days of their program start date. So that gives students a lot more flexibility. I know many institutions are still working on, their own processes. When should we get those I-20s done, those DS 2019s? And perhaps that's put a lot of extra work on your team. But if you're able to get those documents to students earlier, then they have more time to figure out exactly when and where they could do their visa appointments, especially now that they're kind of operating sort of in a black box without being able to see what the wait times look like at different consulates around the world. And so, if that's possible, getting paperwork earlier to students would be very helpful for them. So here are some possible changes that we're looking at. And, there is a lot of speculation happening during this second term for President Trump, mostly because a lot of decisions seem to happen kind of off the cuff. Maybe you'll basically find out with an executive order that he signs on that day. There's a lot of rumors flying around, but what we're looking at is, actually some of this has already come to pass, right? Reduced funding for research, like for NIH funded projects. I've talked to some of my DSO partners, and I think this is a really stressful time as budgets are getting cut, especially if you're relying on funding from the US government. There could be more country specific vetting, like extreme vetting, and like the presidential proclamation that was applicable to China. We're hearing that there is probably a travel ban that is coming out soon, although that has not been finalized yet. Country specific bans, possible STEM OPT restrictions, shorter visa validity. All of these things are, a possibility. I think if any of you have sat in on my webinars before January 20th, I was taking a fairly optimistic approach, and I said, okay, we don't really know what is actually going to happen in this next term. But I think now that we're a couple of months in, we're seeing that President Trump is moving at lightning speed, and immigration and visa issues are definitely a priority for him. And so, do your best to try to keep up on these updates. Sometimes, there's just so many changes being implemented that it's almost difficult to stay on top of all of them. I have a Google alert set up for visa changes. And so Maybe this is something that you would want to do as well, just because there is so many executive orders being signed, and you definitely want to make sure that you're trying to keep up with the amount of changes. Okay, so what can your students expect at a US visa interview this year? Well, what we've seen so far is yes, interviews are getting harder, but let's go back to the basics for just a second. On average, your students really only have about 3 minutes or so to talk to the visa officer at their interview. And in fact, if your students are applying in a high volume post in a country like China or in India, sometimes the interview may be as short as 30 seconds. And so this is not a whole lot of time that students have to talk to the visa officer. And I think most students are surprised by how short this interview is. And they also, many of them don't understand that the way that the law is written, the burden is actually on the student or the scholar to make the case for themselves, to advocate for themselves to the visa officer that they actually qualify for the visa. I think many students go into this visa interview process very passively, believing that, this is, sort of a just an interview where they just have to ask, answer the questions that's asked of them. Well, that's not really exactly the case. I usually like to tell students that it's almost like they have to do a short presentation to showcase why they're eligible for the visa. And your students really can't rely on documents. I think so many students, because they're nervous about this process, they tend to just bring in a thick stack of documents. Maybe some of them are even, telling you, hey, can you write this letter for me? If you write it in exactly this format, this will help me get the visa. Well, the reality is visa officers actually don't really like to look at documents. I remember when I worked as a visa officer, around the world in China and Mexico and Hong Kong, um, you were actually specifically instructed by your manager not to look at documents because that would slow you down. They're really trying to be as efficient as possible. But also, there's another reason. It's because documents can really be forged. When I worked at the US Embassy in Beijing, there were black markets out there that would sell students, invitation letters, school offer letters, uh, housing documents, bank statements, whatever it is they needed, they could actually buy. And the embassy was actively investigating fraud rings that were selling these fake documents. And so, in reaction to this, what visa officers would do is just they're really mainly relying on the interview itself and not what the documents say. And so, it's still important for your students to, bring everything in. They definitely need to have their passport. They need to have their DS 160 confirmation page. They need to have their I-20 or their DS 2019. It's a good idea to have bank statements, but just let your students know that they can't really rely on those documents when it comes to the interview. At the interview, what the visa officer is looking for is they want to have a very candid, short conversation with these foreign national students and scholars to understand what their purpose is. Why do they want to study there? What exactly do they hope to get out of these studies or out of this research? What do they plan to get? And how will this help them in their home country? It's also really important to understand that a visa officer can actually deny a student for any reason at all, and they don't have to explain why they're denying the application. And so this is generally the dreaded 214B visa refusal, where your student will get a very standard piece of paper that just says, hey, you failed to prove your home ties. Unfortunately, you don't qualify for a visa in this moment, but it doesn't give them any specific information on why that visa is denied. And so, what I always tell international students is that, it's actually your job to help the officers reach the right conclusion and the right result with effective communication strategies. It is their job to be honest, be direct, but also do the work so that you're making it as easy as possible for the visa officer to approve their visas. I actually think that shorter visa interviews are better. I work with a lot of students who have problematic cases, very complicated situations, and those interviews end up taking 10 or 15 minutes or even longer. But that's usually when an officer has identified a problem with this application and they're kind of trying to dig to see, is there enough support that I can go ahead and deny this student? Does this person have a permanent ineligibility and they should not be allowed to get a visa in the future? These are the things that they're considering. And so a visa officer is actually always looking for a quick approval or a quick denial. And so you definitely want your students to be in the first group where they're ready for their interview. And that first response to that first question is actually the most important. It sets the tone up for the entire interview. And so if you're a DSO who helps your students with the visa interview process, definitely observe your students. Are they properly explaining themselves? Are they able to clearly get their point across about where they're going to school, what their purpose is, how this affects them? What about funding? How are they paying for their education? All of these are the things that the visa officer needs to know before reaching their decision on whether or not to approve your student's visa. So here's the truth about visa interviews that actually not everybody knows. Your student's visa record actually stays in the US government's computer system forever. And so this means that if your student is denied a visa, there is a record of it. And that visa denial is can be seen by all future visa officers who interview them next. This is why it's so important that students keep their visa records clean. You don't want them to have a whole lot of visa denials, because the more visa denials that you have, the more difficult it is for these students to get approved for any type of visa in the future. Generally, the visa officer will take notes during an interview, and what they put in those notes are usually support for their decisions. So if a person is denied a visa, then those case notes will probably look fairly negative. This is why this person doesn't qualify. This is why I made this decision. Whereas if a student is approved a visa, then usually those notes are positive. Seems like a credible student, has great TOEFL scores, can talk about their plans after they graduate, something like that. Okay, so you definitely want to make sure that your students are ready for the interview, because basically their interaction with the visa officer is sort of recorded down in the officer's case notes that will be accessible to future visa officers, no matter what type of visa they apply for in the future or where they apply in the future. The visa officer will be able to access that information. It's also important to know that consular officers' main focus is really on efficiency. They're trying to interview as quickly as possible. I remember when I worked at the US Embassy in Beijing, China, every single day, almost 5,000 people would come through the waiting room, and all of them would have to be interviewed. And the general rule is the State Department wants every visa officer to interview at least 20 people every hour, sometimes even faster if there is a large volume of applicants that day. And so, it is a really, really tough job. Visa officers, I believe, are aware that every decision they make is very important to the student standing in front of them. But if they go too slowly, they could get a talking to by their manager. At the end of every single day, there is actually a report that prints out that tells you how many people each officer interviewed, what their approval and denial rates are. And so if you're someone who has lagged behind most of the visa officers and you only interviewed 50 people while everybody else interviewed 150 people, that doesn't make you look very good. And this is why they're always trying to go as quickly as possible. And so if your students are coming to you and saying, hey, my visa was denied, I was only asked one or two questions, that's why. Oftentimes, the visa officer, can tell if they're not going to be able to get too much information out of the student because they're not prepared for the interview, then that student might just get a quick denial. Now, if a student has a complicated situation, that is more likely to lead to a visa denial. And what exactly is a complicated situation? Okay, it could be any number of things. It could be, perhaps this is a student who already has a master's degree and they're applying for a second master's. Visa officers like to see that students are progressing in their studies. And so if you're going from a bachelor's to a master's to a PhD, that is, a very classic example of someone who's a progressing student. But if you're interviewing someone who is going for a second or sometimes even a third master's degree, that really is concerning to the visa officer because it doesn't seem like they're progressing. And that's why you could have problems. Another common situation I used to see is if you are a non traditional student. So, what's a non traditional student? That's someone where perhaps their age or their life or their job experience doesn't necessarily seem to set them up for studying in the US. Perhaps this is someone who has been a stay-at-home mom for the last like 5 years, and now all of a sudden she wants to go get a degree in English as a second language. This might cause some concerns from the visa officer who might question her true motives for going to the US. Is she really wanting to go for this degree, or does she just want to go and bring her children so they can go to, attend public school in the US? So these are some of the common things I used to see. Another potential complication, if your students or scholars have pending green cards and they're applying for a type of visa that is subject to immigrant intent, right? So if this person has a pending green card, they can see that in their computer system and it's basically a declaration of immigrant intent. And so that might now mean that they don't qualify for an F1 visa. So there's lots of other types of complicated situations, but anytime a situation is more complicated, looks different than the other students who are interviewing, then your student is likely to have more problems at their visa interview, more likely to be denied. Also, it's important to understand that there's a short interview and your students are going to be really nervous. Usually, this creates like a perfect storm. I always tell students if you're planning to interview for your student visa or your J1 visa, you definitely want to be speaking English. That's what the officer is expecting of you. And so, if there are language barriers or perhaps they're not well versed in English, they could run into issues. Finally, I alluded to this before, but there's a lot of wrong information out there from visa agents and on the internet. It's always really important to emphasize to your students that they need to be honest at their visa interview. I've interviewed so many students where, they probably would have qualified for their visa if the visa agent hadn't made a mistake on their DS 160 or hadn't told them, hey, if you lie about this, you'll definitely get your visa. Or, oh, whether you're single or married is not really that important. So why don't you, not answer that correctly? And then hopefully they'll approve your visa. Like all of this is absolutely wrong information. And I've seen so many international students and foreign nationals hurt by just off cuff, wrong information provided to them by agents. And it's also really important to know that the DS 160 visa application is, what your students have to fill out before the interview. The officer is going to, basically the students will take responsibility for whatever is on that application. And so even if it is being handled by a visa agent, if they get something wrong or they write something that's false, ultimately it will be the student that is held responsible. So it's really important that they double check their DS 160 and double check that everything is accurate and also that they're always honest at their visa interview. I like to tell students, sometimes what you're lying about is probably not even that important. You would qualify for the visa. The visa officer doesn't even care about what you lied about. What they care about is the fact that you did lie. And if you lied about this, what the visa officer is thinking, well, if you're lying about this, how do I know that any of this other stuff that you're telling me is true? And you can also get something called a 61 ineligibility for misrepresentation if you lie at your visa interview, which means that you would have a permanent ban to the United States. And I know that none of us want these students in that situation. Also, one of the things that I've realized over my years working in this industry and also as an immigration attorney now helping international students is that a lot of your students fail their visa interviews not because they don't qualify for the visa, but it's because of ineffective communication. They don't know how to talk to an American government official in just a few minutes' time. And, and that's a big problem because they should be able to pass. They have the funding. They spent all this effort and time applying for schools and they're excited for their education. And ultimately it ends up, being a 3-minute interview where perhaps all those dreams are shattered. And so, it is not a rubber stamp process. Students have to understand that this is something that they need to prepare for. They need to know how to talk to the visa officer. They need to know how to be honest and effective and authentic at their visa interview. Okay, so let's look at a few common myths. So my partner Travis actually recently just filmed a YouTube video about this. If you look at internet forums, so many students believe that visa officers enjoy denying visa applications. That actually couldn't be further from the truth, especially for visiting scholars and for students. Visa officers really actually do want to approve their visas, but sometimes at the interview, the students are just not giving them enough. I just recall some of my worst interview experiences where it's so hard to get any substantive information out of the student. You feel like you have to ask like 10 or 20 questions before you kind of understand exactly what they're doing in the US, why they want to go there, what their plans are. And so again, I think if your students just put a little bit of effort to know what to expect at the interview and how to speak to the visa officer, visa officers more than anything want international students to come to the US. And I know those statistics don't look good, but I think that might also be because students are just not prepared or they're not speaking English or any other possible red flags. Okay, so here is another common myth. Applicants should offer short and one-word answers. I hear so many students say, oh, well, everybody says that I should just try to say as little as possible. I should just only answer the question that I'm asked at the visa interview. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. Our strategy is that students need to be offering relevant and concise information that is also very compelling for the visa officer. What I usually tell students is visa officers spend all day asking questions. That's all they do. Why are you going to the US? Okay, how are you paying for this education? What will you do once you get this degree? They really hate asking questions. So what your students need to do is for some facts, they really need to be volunteering that information. I'll give you one example. If your student has a scholarship from your institution, that is something that they need to bring up right away at their interview. I've had students who come to me with visa denials and they actually have a great scholarship. And I'll mention, oh, were you able to mention this during your visa interview? And the usual response that I hear is, no, the visa officer never asked me. And I'm like, well, it's actually not their job to ask you everything they need to know. It's actually your job to make sure that all of the most positive information about your case is being put in front of the visa officer. And so what we have to teach students and scholars is how to be proactive during the interview. How can they volunteer this information in a very organic and helpful way so that, when the visa officer asks the student one question, the student is not just answering that one question, but also the 10 other questions that are coming up behind it. I really believe that sometimes students can pass their visa interview with just one or two answers. And oftentimes, because of the time constraints these days, visa officers only have time to ask one or two questions. But if they give such a complete answer, 4 or 5 sentences explaining, where are they studying, what type of degree, why, who's paying for it, what are their hopes for the future. That will really help your students be in that, approved in 30 seconds group. And that's really what we want for our students. Another common myth is that visa officers have already decided a case before the interview begins. Visa officers never make a decision on a case before they actually have a chance to talk to the person. However, things happen really quickly. As a student comes up to the window, the first thing the visa officer does is pull up the DS-160. They will scroll halfway down, see if the student has ever been denied a visa before, and then they know how they want to start their interview. They also are paying attention to how your students are dressed, right? Are they dressed really sloppily, like they're not taking this interview seriously? Or do they look like the kind of person that is ready to go study in the US and move to a different country and actually really focus on learning, right? So, all of that is important, especially when you only have 3 minutes. And so, again, those decisions are made fairly quickly. So, you want your students to check all the boxes for doing everything they can to maximize their chances for success, from dressing appropriately to knowing how to answer the first question and how to volunteer information that will be helpful to the visa officer in reaching the right decision. Okay, another common myth. If you memorize a scripted response, you're more likely to be approved. I don't know why this is out there, but I feel like about 50% of students always go to their visa interviews, and if the officer asks them, why do you want to study in the US? They always say something like, because the United States has the best education in the world, and this is the best school for me. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard this answer before. And so, what you really want to do is make sure that your students have a authentic answer that's true to themselves. When I work with students one on one, usually the first answer that they give me is often very scripted, and probably something that they found out from a visa agent or online. And they'll say something about, oh, this school has this many acres and has planted this many trees. Sounds like they're reading information right out of the school's brochure. That is not what you want them to do. You want them to, and then usually as I talk to them a little bit more, I find out their hopes and dreams and why they really want this degree. And I'm like, this is the information you need to be getting out in front of the visa officer, but right away, because they don't have 30 minutes to talk to you. They only have 3. Okay, so anyways, this is, in case you can't tell, this is something that I'm very, very passionate about. So my partner, Travis, and I are both former visa officers and immigration attorneys. And after so many years of interviewing students and scholars and every other type of visa applicant, we've come up with online courses for students. It goes through everything from DS-160, walks them through how to fill out the DS-160 so that they don't, answer something wrong and get a red flag, to how to prepare for your interview. These are all online lessons that your students can go through multiple times, and it also includes exclusive live Q&A with either myself or my partner to answer any questions they have after they've taken our course. I think we've just seen so many students make mistakes in this process that has, kept them from coming to the US to study, that we don't want this to keep happening. And so this is really our passion project. And if this is something that you want to share with your students, reach out to us. Sometimes we offer discount codes for your students. We're happy to provide that for your schools. My partner and I are also lawyers, so we also work individually with students if they've had visa denials or administrative processing. We do work with a lot of DSOs who send us students with complicated situations. So here's our email address. Please write it down if you ever have any questions about your students' cases. We're here for you. We're here to help. And then finally, we have started doing a lot of individual webinars for universities and their incoming students, telling them exactly how to prepare for the visa interview. These are really like short mini courses on how to succeed, how to maximize their chances, how to prepare for that first question. These are some of our university partners. And if this is something that you're interested in for your admitted students, please send us an email. We're happy to chat with you, and we definitely want to help your students. And finally, we also have a lot of free resources for international students. We have a YouTube channel called at ZF Visa and an Instagram channel. And my partner and I are always filming new videos on, how can you avoid a visa denial? How soon should you reapply after? Every single type of visa we have different tips for. I think so far we have like 90 something videos, but feel free to share our channels with your students so that they can at least get some free advice from people who have, you know, really been on the other side of the window and really know what your students are up against and how they really have to take advantage of the few minutes they have with a visa officer to be ready for this process. Okay, I'll leave that up, but I'm happy to take Q&A. Sorry, I've been talking for a really long time. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And I think, Morona, you said you had some questions as well from students.
Yeah. A couple quick highlights or comments really quickly. So, I put the link to the ZF Visas resources for students in the chat. So feel free to use that, grab that there. And then one comment for those universities that are using Homebase, ZF Visa. So Mandy and Travis built um, the visa preparation resources that are listed there in those pre-arrival courses, and so in the templates. So if you're using Homebase currently, you can go grab that and compare that to the template and pull that content into your pre-arrival modules and make that available directly to your students. If your students or scholars are in Homebase, then they will be receiving emails from us about upcoming webinars with Mandy and Travis. As you can see, they're very helpful with the content that they are providing, and so we look forward to having those. The first one will be next week, and I put the link to that in the chat. You can feel free to register for that yourself, or have make that available to your students or scholars to register for as well. And so there's also two additional webinars that the links are in the chat. If you want to look at those, it is the Know Their Rights advising on travel and Know Their Rights advising on activities in the U.S. So just a couple housekeeping items there. Yes, there are lots and lots of questions. We will have, we do plan to go a little over time. If for those who can stick around, it may take us. We'll just answer questions as they come through. For the student webinars, we asked them what questions they had. So I'm going to just kind of rapid fire go through some of the common questions that students are asking, and so you can kind of get a model of how you might respond to those. And by the way, when I say students, just we're students and scholars. The different audiences kind of go together. Actually, Mandy, before I jump into that's a different question. Maybe would you make any distinctions on what you look for in the interview, or how applicants should be responding if they're on an F1 versus a J1 versus other employment visas?
Yeah, so for a J1 visa applicant, they most definitely should speak English. That's one of the requirements of the visa class. And so when a visa officer sees a DS 2019 form, they're going to automatically start the conversation in English. And they likely will do the same for F1 students, but F1 students sometimes are going for language programs. So it's a little bit more flexible in whether or not they have to be fluent in English or not. So that's probably one of the biggest differences.
Okay. All right. Couple quick questions. What are ways someone can prove strong ties to their home country?
Mm. So I think one way to talk about home ties is talking about your family that are in your home country, and also perhaps talking about whether or not your family owns real estate. These are just some specific facts that sometimes visa officers look for. I think the challenge for students is you don't want to, I always tell students, you really want to show and not tell the officer your response. And how you get the officer to believe you is by offering a lot of details and context about your family situation. For example, if your father is funding your education and he has been a university professor in your home country for over 20 years, that immediately to a visa officer is a very strong tie, right? You have family members in your home country, they've been working in the same job for a really long time. But when the student offers up that answer, they're not necessarily saying, "Hey, officer, I have really strong ties. I have a dad who's been a professor for many years," right? So you kind of want to organically work that into your conversation with the visa officer by showing them and not telling them. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Perfect. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Okay, I have a specific question. My dad overstayed his visa in 2020 and came back in April 2023. I got accepted to two universities, but due to my dad's issue, the visas got denied twice. I'm curious because I want to further my education. What should I do?
Sorry, Moroni, did you say the dad was denied twice or was the student denied
The
twice?
student was denied twice after the father overstayed.
Okay. So that's really interesting because I think I would probably need a little bit more facts from the student. If the dad is no longer in the US, then on the DS-160 form, where it says, "Do you have family in the US?" he can check no, because the dad is back in his home country. So oftentimes, this is really interesting. If a student is really prepared for the visa interview, oftentimes they won't even dig into the father's background or the father's situation. But sometimes, if a student is very passive in the process and the visa officer is frustrated and trying to get more information, maybe over the course of that happening, they could dig more into the case and realize, oh, the dad has an overstay situation. But usually each visa applicant stands on their own. And so I would say, this is probably something where they're now that they've had a couple of visa denials, they need a little bit more help because what they're doing is not working.
Okay, my child was born in the US and she will likely be traveling with me when I go to the US to study. Would this situation have any impact on my chances of getting a visa?
It shouldn't, because if you interview, you don't have to bring your child to the interview. I actually recommend that all visa applicants do the interview on their own. And then if she has a passport, she can just travel. However, if the visa officer specifically asks, "Is your family going with you?" Of course, you have to be honest. But again, you don't have to volunteer the information that your child is a US citizen unless they ask you.
Along those same lines, I saw there's a question in the chat around when to apply for F2s or J2s. Should they apply at the same time or is it recommended that they wait?
Yeah.
Generally recommend that sorry, can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I think my AirPods died. Okay, hold on. I generally recommend for the principal applicants to interview on their own first, because if you do bring a lot of family members with you, sometimes that sends a signal to the visa officer, like, are you really serious about your education, or is this just like a big family, family get together? So better to have the principal applicant interview first. But during that interview, it's really important that they're honest with the visa officer about whether or not family members will be joining them, because sometimes they'll be asked that. And it's also asked in the DS-160. I have had several clients now run into this issue where the principal applicant at the interview says, "No, my family's staying here and not joining me." They change their minds later. The family members end up applying and get denied because they asked the question and the visa applicant had said, "No, my family's not coming." So, anyways, it's as with all visa questions, it's a little nuanced. Principal applicant interviews first, but then be honest about whether family members are joining them. Family members can apply later.
Okay. All right. Question from Brooke Thomas. What if any, access to information about USCIS petitions do consular officers have? For example, approved I-140 without a filed I-485 for a non-immigrant visa applicant. Context, fear of applying for a non-immigrant visa because of a pending or approved I-140,
Mm.
which is in itself not an affirmative step towards immigration status. How can we advise our students or scholars in this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, visa officers generally can see when a green card has been filed for someone. Now, we don't know exactly when that gets input into the system or if it only happens after, the I-485 has been filed. But I think you want to assume that once the I-140 is filed, that it will be visible to the visa officer, which means that your student or scholar needs to be ready to explain that pending green card. Now, just because you have a pending green card doesn't necessarily mean you don't qualify for a non-immigrant visa, but it is important how your student handles the situation because if they're just like deer in headlights when asked about the pending green card, that obviously is not a good look, right? It looks like maybe you're trying to hold something back from the visa officer, maybe you're not trying to be transparent. Whereas, an answer might be something along the lines of, oh, yeah, my family applied for the EB-5 investment visa, many years ago, and we're still waiting on the process. And then the visa officer might be like, oh, okay, no problem. Like that sounds totally fine. Now you're focused on your studies. But I think they need to be honest and they need to know what to say in that situation. And actually, that's something that we address in our course. What if you have a pending green card? How do you talk about that?
Okay. Do more denials happen when a student has a sponsor, um, a direct family member in the United States as a sponsor?
Yes, I think that is probably seen as a red flag. And again, it's so fact specific. It'll depend on, how close is this family member? Is this an immediate family member or someone that they don't really know and don't really talk to? Um, I do think that in those cases, it's probably better that it's not the family member in the US sponsoring them. You'll want to find other ways to sponsor the education because that just seems like a really strong tie to the US if that family member is sponsoring. Um, and I think it's also really important to clarify the relationship. And also, this is really key, explaining during the interview that if you have any family members in the US, what are they doing in the US? How did they immigrate to the US? What is their status? What is their job? And to have your students go through that really quickly because visa officers base those decisions based on what these family members have done in the past. So if it's a family member who actually went to study in the US 20 years ago, now has a great job as senior engineer at Google, isn't someone that is super close to the student, that isn't necessarily a red flag. But if the student doesn't offer up any information about what that family member is doing in the US, that could definitely be seen as a red flag.
Thank you. Helpful. Okay, so do you have any information or data on F1 denial rates based on type of institution, i.e., English school versus community college versus a non-degree program? There's another similar question on athletes. So do athletes get a higher denial rate than others than non-athletes, et cetera? And
Mhm.
are you aware of any sources of data that break out, parse out denial rates like that?
Yeah, unfortunately, the State Department doesn't offer, any further breakdown besides just the type of visa and the denial rates. However, as a former visa officer, I can tell you that um, students going to community colleges or going for English as a second language programs tend to be scrutinized more than students going to four-year universities. And it's not necessarily because, the visa officer has a vendetta against community colleges or doesn't like them. I think it's purely because visa officers understand that four-year universities have a more rigorous vetting process for students. And it's easier to get into a community college. And so for them, they kind of take it upon themselves to scrutinize the application a little bit more heavily if you're just going to a community college because they know that the school was fairly easy to get into.
Okay. Question from Mark. Is there a usual reason for a J2 visa denial? This has happened enough times that it is raising my concerns.
Yes, that's very unusual. I think for dependent visa applications, it's usually pretty like unusual to be denied a dependent visa. Those visas are generally dependent on, a marriage certificate and a short conversation about the legitimacy of the marriage and the relationship. So if you're getting that denial, it means something else is happening. Oftentimes, what happens with dependent visas is it gives the visa officers a chance to check up on the principal applicant. Let's just say a dependent visa applicant is coming in, they're joining their spouse in the US. The officer quickly checks in SEVIS and realizes that the principal applicant's SEVIS has been deactivated, right? And maybe sometimes there's a good reason for it. They don't know. But they're going to deny that visa because they're like, well, this student is no longer in status. And so, again, they're going to take that opportunity to check up on the principal applicant. So, if the principal applicant has already traveled to the US and has done something suspicious, I'll give you some examples of what I've seen. You know, immediately after getting to the US, they've transferred to a different school and then they dropped out and then they decided to transfer to a third school. That is very suspicious behavior, and that might cause the dependents to have their visas denied.
Okay, you may have gone into this one a little bit. A student asked me who they should list as their references to in the US on their DS 160. Any insight?
Yeah, I think it's best that it's the university. So it could be the DSO, it could be, basically a representative of the school, maybe somebody who is doing the intake process for students. I think that's best. If they use their family members, if they have family in the US, I think that always looks a little bit suspicious because it's like you really want the application to be focused on the student and the studies. And they're expecting it to be the school or the admissions counselor. They're not expecting it to be the aunt who they're planning to live with. That's always a little bit concerning because that shows a very strong tie to the US.
Got it. Can many denials lead to the individual being banned?
No, it doesn't matter how many times a student has been denied an F1 visa. It doesn't mean a ban. A ban is something completely different. That usually happens if you're caught in a lie to the visa officer. My partner Travis sometimes likes to tell the story that he remembers one time approving a student visa for someone who had been denied 9 times. That's a crazy number of times to be denied and then finally get the visa. So, it can be a little bit of a subjective process. Every visa officer thinks a little bit differently, although they do receive the same trainings and the State Department wants them to reach the same conclusion. But that's not necessarily the case. So sometimes what I tell students is for this process, especially if you've had a denial, you kind of have to have a little bit of thick skin, but you also have to educate yourself on this process, on what it takes to succeed.
All right, kind of a longer question about foreign service officers. Okay, following the pandemic, there was a shortage of foreign service officers, and the contract and service terms were edited to allow more applicants for the FSO positions. We have seen several visa officers with very limited experience getting hired and placed in major U.S. missions, and this also caused some issues with visa interviews and cases. Do you think this will be even more of an issue with budget cuts, furloughs, and early retirements from the State Department?
Yeah, I think that's always a risk. Visa officers having gone through the experience so many times and moving to different countries, when you're a visa officer and you arrive in country, you're almost immediately just put on the visa line and you're already starting to make decisions about people's visa applications. Now, you may have just gotten to China last week and you don't really know what the cultural customs are. You don't know if the student qualifies, but they have these numbers that they have to get through. And so, unfortunately, it's not super unusual to hear stories about, an officer maybe not even understanding, what they're doing or seeming really inexperienced. In those cases, you probably will just want your student to reapply, but make sure that they're extra prepared because they already have a denial on their record. Whether or not this is more likely to happen, it's so hard to say. I think, you know, everything is going to take longer and be slower and probably be a worse experience for visa applicants given the budget cuts.
Yeah, that was Travis's takeaway as well. It's just expect delays, like expect them across the board. So, all right, what is the likelihood of approval for a student who did a change of status from B2 to F1 in the
Mm.
United States, now is applying for the visa stamp in the home country? Any recommendations?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked this question. I think it's really important to know that USCIS and the State Department, because they're two completely different agencies, they actually have different standards. So I've seen many students in this situation where they're thinking, well, USCIS already approved my change of status. So this is just going to be a quick, stamping, right? Rubber stamp. I'm going to go back to my home country. That's not the case because visa officers really don't like it when people change their status from a B1, B2 to an F. They think that the right way to do this is if you want to go study in the US, you return to your home country, you apply for an F1 visa stamp just like everyone else. And I think the reason why they think that is because American visa officers look at everything through an American lens. And what they're thinking is if you went to the US to go on vacation for 2 weeks, how could it be possible that all of a sudden you get there and you're like, oh, I'm just going to stay here and go to school? They're thinking, I would never do that if I went on vacation to Europe. I would never just, with the clothes on my back, just decide that I'm going to stay there and start studying. And so it makes them very suspicious. And so this student will have a tough interview coming up. So they need to be very ready to explain not only why, do they want to go to the school, all the normal F1 visa interview questions, but also what happened to make them want to change their status in the US. And it's important that they convey that in a very authentic way to overcome that.
Okay, and then a follow-up question. Do we also know the likelihood of visa denials for students who are renewing their F1 visa so they can travel outside the US?
Um, we don't have specific numbers. I can tell you from my experience that, if your student is renewing their visa, try to do it if they still have a significant portion of their studies left to do. At one of my last webinars, I had mentioned to a DSO, do your best to not have your students renew their visas during OPT, or perhaps they just have a month of school left and they're renewing. Because there's this weird sense from the visa officer that, like, if you're almost done, like, I don't want to approve another 4 or 5 year visa for you. So you want to do it a little bit earlier in the process and you want to do it before the substantive studies are over.
Oh, perfect. Okay, do you have only a certain number of visas to give out or a certain number of denials that you need to make?
No, there is no quota. And actually, we just put up a YouTube video about that because everybody thinks that there's a certain number of visas you have to deny. There is no quota. Visa officers can approve everybody if everybody qualifies.
Okay, is there any data highlighting the F visa denials? Oh, we already went over that one. Uh, and then we keep going down. Our F1 visa Canadian students are notifying us that they're being told to apply for an ESTA visa prior to re-entering in the US. Has there been any changes to the visa waiver between Canada and the US?
There hasn't been, but visa officers and individual consular sections have so much power over individual cases. That seems unusual, but if it seems like it's something they're specifically requesting your students to do, and if it's not too hard, I would say just go ahead and do it. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been changes.
Okay, is there concern that immigration policies for uh, Canadian, Bermudan, or Mexican students may change?
It's always possible.
Kind of. Okay, yeah. Okay, keep going. One second. Multiple schools are reporting on the NAFSA ISTA forums today that visa revocations, which previously left the CVIS records active, are now also resulting in SEVP termination. The CVIS terminating the CVIS record for otherwise failing to maintain status. Any thoughts or insights into this?
I don't have any insights into this, but I will say if someone's had their visa revoked already, um, to a visa officer, it probably doesn't make a huge difference that their service record was also terminated. They probably are expecting it to. So it actually doesn't surprise me.
If somebody's applying while pregnant, or particularly in the third trimester, uh,
Mhm.
is that a perceived issue?
That's definitely a perceived issue. Going to the US to give birth in the past used to be a legitimate use of your B1, B2 as long as you can prove it's like medical tourism, basically. But Trump in his first administration made that no longer a legitimate reason. So if you're someone who is visibly pregnant, you're probably going to have trouble getting your visa approved. And even if you do, you may have trouble when you arrive at the port of entry.
Well, that is interesting. Okay. Here's a follow-up question. I've read some issues with some students at the port of entry running into challenges where their tuition had not been paid, and that was called out by the officer. So, do you have any comment? And then we had another question from students about housing. Um,
Mhm.
is there uh, anything related to should they have their housing or their tuition booked and paid for
Mhm.
before they reach a point of entry, port of entry?
If it's possible, that obviously helps. I would also recommend that you bring like physical bank statements to show that you have the ability to pay for it if you haven't done that already. I think any payment obviously can be helpful. I've heard that CBP has been tough on this issue even after visa approval. And so, yes, bring bank statements. If you can pay it ahead of time, you can. I know that not everybody can do that. So if you can't, then just bring proof that you are able to pay for it, I think is helpful. And again, they should be ready to engage with the CBP officer and talk to them in a way that's effective.
Okay. All right. So is the financial guarantee valid for 6 or 12 months?
That I don't know because that's not something that visa officers really care about. I think what they care about is in speaking to your student that they are convinced that your student can pay for the tuition, whether it's through a combination of scholarship, other funding, sponsorship, whatever it is.
Okay. A student applied for an F1 with his dependent child. They were denied. Now he would like to remove the F2 in the I-20. Will this affect his chance to get approved the second time?
Not really, because the F2 is eligible for a visa. But I think there's always optics, right? That's why I always advise principal applicants, the F1s, to apply on their own first, because then the officer is just focused on your purpose of travel and what you're doing in the US instead of constantly thinking, like, oh, he's bringing his kid. Is this for his kid to go to school in the US, right? Um, but now that you've already done that, just removing the F2 isn't necessarily going to help. In fact, they might ask, oh, well, your child applied with you last time. Why is he not here now? Like, why has this changed? And so, um, yeah, so be prepared for that question.
Okay. We have students who have been approved for severe economic hardship authorizations to work off campus. Some students are concerned about leaving the US for the summer and being denied reentry. How concerned would you recommend that they be?
I think in the current environment, very concerned. People with valid visa statuses are getting, their visa status, their green cards taken away. I think I would be as conservative as possible right now, and I probably would recommend they don't leave.
Yeah, we'll also dive a little bit further into this with Kathleen Gasparian and Jim Hacking, some immigration lawyers in our webinar in 2 weeks. So we'll do a little bit more detail on that one.
Mhm.
Um, do international students need to obtain a new F1 visa page if their current F1 visa is still valid, but their I-20 CVIS record has been terminated and received a new I-20 or CVIS record?
I remember this question and it's very like nuanced. I'm pretty sure they don't need an F1 visa stamp, but I don't know for sure. I'm gonna have to look into this one and get back to you.
Perfect. Okay. Do international students need to obtain a new F1 visa page if their current F1 visa is still valid, um, but their I-20 CVIS record has been terminated and received a new I-20
I think that
CVIS.
was the one we just answered, right?
Yeah, well, uh, came in twice. Okay,
Oh, got it.
uh, granted, some new ones. Okay, so advice for students who cannot pay their tuition fees after entering the U.S. with proof of finances.
I don't know. You know, I think that, this is something that the US government is trying to avoid in the first place, to have someone arrive and not be able to pay their tuition. And obviously, they may not be able to do that. I don't know. I don't have advice for students in that situation.
Okay. Okay, so follow-up question on travel from earlier. Would you recommend that essentially no one leave under the current administration?
What I always tell my own clients is you really have to think hard about whether or not you want to leave right now. If it's just for vacation or something, then I would say it's not worth the risk. Of course, people have serious reasons that they have to depart, and then they have to weigh that and see if it's worthwhile. I generally advise against people leaving right now. I had a client the other day who is a Pakistani student and is thinking about leaving right now to see his family because he hasn't seen them in 5 years. But, there's rumors that a new travel ban involving, Pakistani nationals could be implemented any day now. So I highly advised against it, but ultimately it's up to him and how important the reason of travel is.
Okay, kind of a nuanced question here. How soon after an arrest would the U.S. Embassy notice a student has been arrested? Any way for the student to learn if their visa is revoked? Department of State has stated that the student would be notified via email used in their application, but this is not always the case. Any way for the student to learn if their visa is revoked prior to travel?
Yeah. I think if a student has ever been arrested and had their fingerprints taken, they should just assume that the State Department will know. And there's actually multiple systems that they check this information from. So it's not, sometimes they do a name check as well, someone with the same name and date of birth. And so they really need to be prepared that the State Department probably knows. I would not gamble with that. Like, oh, maybe they don't know right now, so I can leave right now. Just assume that they know and be ready for questions. They should have all of the arrest paperwork with them that'll help the visa officer make a decision as to whether or not they still qualify.
Okay, perfect. All right, we may have made it to the end of the questions if nothing comes in before we finish this next one. So, oh, never mind. Okay, so how does applying in a country other than the country of your citizenship or permanent residency affect the chances of getting a visa? What are the risks of applying in a different country?
That is a great question. So, when you apply outside of your home country, you're applying as what's called a third country national. And just know that there is a risk of increased scrutiny. Usually, the visa officer at a different place may not understand your culture, and that might give them less confidence to be able to approve your visa, and they might scrutinize your case more closely and ask you lots of questions, and then decide that they're not the right office to make a decision, and ultimately say, okay, you have to go back to your home country to apply, which I know is like super frustrating. So, in those cases, students have to be extra prepared to explain why they're applying outside of their home country. And I generally recommend, and I actually mention this in all of our trainings too, that if a student is thinking about applying outside of their home country, they should go to a place that other students with their nationality have gone and been successful. And just as a general rule of thumb, go to a bigger embassy or consulate instead of a small consulate that's not used to seeing a different type of passport. They're definitely not going to want to approve the visa.
That's helpful. Okay. How will a change of status for a green card be affected if the student is currently on an active F1 visa? The student got married and has an employment authorization card. Could it deny their change of status for the green card?
It's possible. There's lots of reasons for denials of green cards. Sometimes it's a technical issue, sometimes it's something else. But generally, for marriage visas, it's pretty straightforward. So I would say don't worry about it until you have to. Um, but if the green card is denied, then yes, obviously there are risks because they would have to leave the country and then they probably will have trouble qualifying for a non-immigrant visa since they're now married to a US citizen and have sort of declared that immigrant intent.
Okay, perfect. All right, so change of status always has two options. One is by travel and the other is by application to USCIS. In this current climate, do you think it is better to advise to change of status by application?
I think it really depends because visa officers overseas really don't like change of status applications. So I think, you're going to have to weigh it because yes, they can stay in the country if they just do the change of status in country and not have to leave. But then in the future, if they need another non-immigrant visa, they could have a hard time with the visa officer. Now, if you just leave right now and reapply for a new F1 stamp instead of doing the change of status, in the current climate, it's a little bit more difficult. I would just say probably do it as soon as possible, before things get even worse. But I don't know. It's hard. It's a toss up.
Okay, a follow-up on an earlier question about employment. If we have employees that are green card holders who travel to recruit and work with international students, do we need to worry that permanent residents will not be allowed to re-enter?
You know, like a month ago, I would say you don't have anything to worry about. I think these days you do have to be a little bit more worried. I would say make sure those employees are very careful on social media. Make sure that they're not being very outspoken politically in one way or the other, because that has definitely been a flag for the current administration. And these days, just having a green card will not protect you. So you want to take all the precautions.
Okay, all right. And then do you recommend F1 visa holders maintain their F1 visa status and school enrollment if they are in, they have applied for a change of status to permanent resident status and have only obtained an employment authorization?
I think it really depends on the situation. I'm guessing you mean like adjusting status to permanent resident status. I mean, if they've already gotten that approved, then I don't think they have to maintain the F1. But these days I think it's always a good idea to just play it safe and maybe keep the F1 until the the green card or the permanent resident status has been approved.
Okay, I think we did it. I think we made it.
Yay.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Thanks for those who stayed over time, and we enjoyed the time. I will send a follow-up email with the slides and the recording when it is ready, and with information about the other webinars and information for both DSOs and AROs and for students, and then also information about Homebase for anybody that would like to learn about that. So. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. It was great to see you all. Thank you for such great questions.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.